Most people who know the Old West think they know its stories. The outlaws, the sheriffs, the gunfights at noon. But every now and then, you find one that doesn't fit any of those boxes. One that makes you stop and just sit with it for a while. This is one of those. His name was Toucan. Most people who crossed his path knew him as Eli. Both names were true. That's where the story starts. He was 7 years old when the soldiers came to the Chiricahua camp at the foot of the Dragoon Mountains. The raid lasted less than an hour. By the time the dust settled and the hoofbeats faded into the distance, the boy was the only living soul left standing among the ruins. He hadn't survived because he was brave. He survived because his mother had pushed him beneath a fallen cart and pressed her hand over his mouth until everything went silent. Her hand was gone when the silence finally came. The boy wandered for 2 days through the desert scrubland. No water, no food, no direction. He walked because stopping felt like dying, and some part of him, some stubborn kernel deep in his chest, refused to do that. Not yet. The Arizona sun was merciless above him, the kind of heat that makes the air ripple like water and turns your own shadow into a stranger. His feet bled. His lips split, and still he walked. It was a cattle drover named Soren Whitfield who found him. Soren wasn't the kind of man who looked for trouble or invited it in. He was 51 years old, weathered and lean, with the kind of silence that comes from spending too many years talking to cattle instead of people. He ran a modest ranch outside the town of Benson, employed 3 hands, and had buried a wife and a daughter in the span of 4 years. Facts he never discussed and never forgot. When his horse stopped at the edge of a dry creek bed and refused to move, Soren looked down and saw the boy lying face up in the cracked earth, staring at the sky with eyes that weren't quite conscious and weren't quite gone. He could have ridden past. There were men in those days who would have. Instead, Soren Whitfield climbed down from his horse, poured the last of his canteen over the boy's cracked lips, and loaded him across the saddle like a sack of feed. No one in Benson was particularly happy about it. The boy had no name they could pronounce, or at least none he was willing to give. He understood some English, enough to follow basic commands, enough to know when the men at the general store were calling him something ugly. But he spoke none of it for the first 3 months. He simply watched. He ate what was put in front of him, slept in the small room off the barn that Soren gave him, and watched everything with those dark, flat eyes that the ranch hand said made them uncomfortable. "He looks at you like he's measuring something," said one of the hands, a broad-shouldered man named Virgil, one evening over supper. "Like he's deciding." "Maybe he is," Soren said, and left it at that. By the time autumn came, the boy had a name, at least for the purposes of Benson, Arizona. Soren had taken to calling him Eli, not for any religious reason, but because it was short and clean, and the boy hadn't flinched when he first heard it. That was as close to agreement as Soren figured he'd get. The boy's real name, the name his mother had whispered into his hair on the morning she died, was Toucan. He kept it folded somewhere behind his ribs, private and intact. The one thing no one had managed to take from him yet. Eli learned fast. That was the thing about him that no one quite expected. Within a year, he spoke English with a fluency that startled the school teacher in town, a thin, nervous woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who had agreed to take him on mostly because Soren had paid her double. Within 2 years, Eli could ride as well as any hand on the ranch, could read the sky for weather, could track a stray calf across 3 miles of broken scrubland and bring it back without being asked. He had a gift for stillness that made him an extraordinary hunter. He could wait longer than anyone, quieter than anyone, and when he moved without wasted motion. Soren watched all of this and said very little, which was his way of saying he was proud. But Benson had its own way of watching too. There were moments, small ones at first, easy to dismiss, when the town reminded Eli of what he was and wasn't. A merchant who put his hands flat on the counter when Eli reached for something, as though protecting his merchandise by instinct. Boys at the water trough who called him names in Spanish and English, both of which he understood. A deputy sheriff named Colton who had a habit of appearing whenever Eli was in town alone, standing just close enough to be a warning without quite crossing a line. These moments accumulated the way silt accumulates in a dry riverbed, invisible, until suddenly you realize the water can't flow anymore. Eli didn't speak of these things to Soren. He wasn't sure Soren would know what to do with them. The old man had given him shelter and food and something close to dignity, and Eli understood that was more than most would have offered. He didn't want to complicate it with the truth. The truth was this: he was not Eli Whitfield, not really. He was Tucane of the Chiricahua, and no amount of English, no amount of cattle driving or church attendance or hat-tipping to the ladies of Benson was going to change the way he felt when he stood at the edge of the desert at dawn and heard the wind move through the mesquite like a voice he almost recognized. If you've been with this story from the beginning, go ahead and drop a like. It helps more than you know and keeps these stories coming. The breaking point, when it finally came, didn't arrive with drama. It arrived quietly, the way the worst things often do. Eli was 19 years old. He had been at the Whitfield Ranch for 12 years. He had become, in every practical sense, essential to its operation. Soren's eyesight was failing. The other hands had drifted on, and it was Eli who managed the accounts, negotiated with the cattle buyers from Tucson, and kept the whole fragile thing running. There was an unspoken understanding between them. The ranch would eventually be his, not in writing, not in anything that could be pointed to, but in the way Soren looked at him sometimes. There was a kind of inheritance being quietly transferred. That spring, 3 men rode onto the Whitfield land without invitation. Their names were Holt, Crane, and a third man who went only by Rip, land agents working on behalf of a railroad company, pushing west through the territory. They were polite in the way that men are polite when they've already decided the outcome of a conversation. They spoke directly to Soren, ignoring Eli completely even as he stood 3 feet away, and they explained that the route they needed would cut directly through the southern pasture. They offered a figure. It was low. Soren, who was tired and half-blind, and maybe not thinking clearly, shook hands. When they rode away, Eli looked at the contract they'd left and found the clause buried in the 3rd paragraph. The right-of-way granted wasn't just the southern pasture, it was everything within 400 yards of the track line. That included the main house. He tried to explain it to Soren that evening. The old man listened. There was a long silence. "Maybe it'll be all right," Soren said finally. "It won't," Eli told him. It wasn't. The surveyors arrived 6 weeks later, then the lawyers, and the legal structure that followed moved with the precision of something designed specifically to be impossible to fight. The ranch, the house, the barn, the 12 years of Eli's life embedded in its walls, was absorbed by the railroad's expansion within 4 months. Soren was given a reduced settlement and a handshake. Eli was given nothing, because in the eyes of the territorial court, he held no claim to anything. He stood outside the ranch on the morning they were forced to leave and looked at what remained of everything Soren had built, everything he had quietly made his own. And something shifted in him. Not broke, shifted. Like a fault line that doesn't collapse so much as realign. He set Soren up in a boarding house in Benson with enough money from the settlement to last him 2 years. He bought the old man's horse for twice what it was worth, left him most of the cash, and told him he'd be back. He didn't know if that was true. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. There are more stories like this one waiting, and you don't want to miss them. Eli rode south for 3 days. He wasn't sure why south, only that south felt like the right direction. The way the compass in your chest knows things your brain is still catching up to. He slept in the open, ate what he could find, and let the desert work on him the way it used to when he was a child, stripping away the unnecessary, clarifying things. On the 3rd night, he made a fire in a shallow canyon. and he sat with it for a long time, and he said his own name out loud for the first time in 12 years. Toucan. It sounded like something he'd forgotten and just remembered. What happened next is the part of his story that history has trouble with, because it doesn't fit neatly into the categories that were available at the time. He wasn't a renegade in the way the newspapers understood the word. He wasn't a casualty either, not exactly. He was something more complicated than either of those things, a man standing at the exact center of a contradiction, deciding which direction to fall. He found the Chiricahua. It took weeks, and it required him to put aside everything about himself that had been formed in English, to move through the land the way he had moved through it as a child before the fire. He followed water. He read the earth for signs that weren't visible to anyone who hadn't grown up knowing what to look for. And eventually, in the mountains east of the San Simon Valley, he found a camp of 37 people. What was left of what had been in his mother's time, a much larger world. The man who greeted him wasn't friendly. He was perhaps 45, with a face like cracked leather and eyes that had seen things that made Benson, Arizona look like a children's story. His name was Delche, and he was the closest thing this remnant band had to a leader, which he was mostly by default. The elders and warriors who should have held that position had been killed or taken to the reservation at San Carlos, and Delche had survived mostly because he was difficult to catch. The first conversation they had lasted most of the night, and it was not warm. Delche spoke to Eli in Apache, which Eli understood imperfectly, struggling to locate words that had been buried under a decade of English. He was questioned for hours. Where had he been? What had he done? Who was he now? The questions weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. They were the questions of a man who had every reason to be suspicious of someone who had spent 12 years living among the people who had destroyed their world. Eli answered everything honestly. He made no apologies for what he was, only explained it. He had been a child. He had survived the only way available to him. He had not forgotten where he came from, even when it would have been easier. Delche listened to all of it, and then was quiet for a very long time. "What do you want?" he asked finally. Eli thought about it. "To stop losing things," he said. It was the truest thing he'd said in years. He stayed. The reintegration wasn't easy or romantic. There were people in the camp who didn't trust him and never would, who looked at his English fluency and his cowboy posture and saw something contaminated. He learned to live with that. He relearned Apache not as a language of memory but as a language of daily function, and the process was humbling in a way that nothing in Benson had ever been. He was starting over, but he was starting with something, the desert knowledge that had never left him, the patience, the stillness, the ability to move without waste. Within a year, he had become essential to Delche's band in a way that had nothing to do with sentiment. He understood the Anglo world. He could read their documents, decipher their legal language, anticipate their strategies. When the army sent negotiators to the mountains with offers that sounded reasonable on the surface and were designed to dispossess on the back end, it was Eli who read the terms aloud in Apache and pointed to exactly where the trap was buried. The band made different decisions because of this. Some of those decisions kept them alive. And then came the winter of the cattle raids. Here is where this story asks something of you. The same thing it asked of the people who were there, because what Toucan did next was something that, depending on where you were standing, was either a betrayal or a reckoning. It was probably both. The ranches along the San Simon Valley had been pushing deeper into Apache territory for 2 years, backed by the Army's new policy of treating any Apache presence east of the reservation line as hostile. Delche's band was being squeezed. The hunting grounds were shrinking. 3 young men in the camp had died of something that looked like contaminated water from a stream downhill of a new mining operation. The children were thin. Toucan organized the raids himself. He knew those ranches. He knew their layouts, their routines, their weaknesses, because he had spent 12 years learning the architecture of that world from the inside. He knew which ranchers had hands who would fight and which ones would panic. He knew the supply lines, the patterns, the predictable rhythms of men who believed they were safe. He used all of it. The raids were surgical, and they were effective. Cattle were taken, fences were cut. 2 supply wagons bound for an army outpost were intercepted without a shot fired. The drivers left unharmed and shaken, the supplies redistributed. Word spread through the territory with the particular speed that fear travels. And suddenly the name attached to those raids, the Apache who knew too much, who moved like a ghost and thought like an Anglo, became something that people in Benson spoke about in lowered voices. The newspapers called him a renegade. The army put a bounty on his head. What the newspapers didn't report, what wouldn't have fit the story they were already telling, was the morning Tucain rode alone to the edge of the Whitfield property, which by then had been absorbed into a larger ranch operation, and sat on his horse for a long time looking at the place where he had grown up. The barn was gone. The small room off its side wall, where he'd spent his first years listening to the sounds of the desert and slowly learning the sounds of a new language, was gone. The cottonwood tree Soren had planted the year Eli arrived, as a kind of unofficial welcome, had been cut down. He sat there long enough that a ranch hand came out with a rifle, saw who it was, and backed slowly inside. Tucain turned his horse and rode back into the mountains. Delche, who had lived long enough to have seen many things, asked him that evening what he'd gone to look for. "I don't know," Tucain said. "I think I needed to see that it was actually gone." And it is. There is a moment in almost every story like this one. The moment where the person at the center of it has to make a choice that can't be unmade. Not the dramatic choice, not the one with guns and witnesses. The quiet one. The one made alone in the dark that changes the direction of everything that follows. For Tucain, that moment came in the spring of his second year with Delche's band. An army column was moving through the valley below, not toward the camp specifically, but in a pattern that would bring them close enough. There was a family of settlers in a homestead 3 miles south who would be directly in the path of what Tucain knew was coming. He'd seen that family once from a ridge, a woman, a man, 2 small children. They'd done nothing to him. They probably knew nothing of what surrounded them. He could have let the column pass without warning. He could have done nothing. In the calculus of what had been taken from his people, doing nothing would have been entirely defensible. He sent a rider with a message, unsigned. The family left before dawn. Some things you do not explain. You just do them, and you let them live alongside everything else you've done, and you accept that a man can be more than one thing at a time. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done? Would you have sent that warning, or would history have made the choice for you? The army never caught Tucain. That isn't quite the ending the story seems to be building toward, and maybe that's part of what makes it worth telling. There was no climactic standoff, no poetic last stand. He simply became increasingly difficult to locate, which was what he had been working toward all along. Not martyrdom, not legend, but survival. Quiet, sustained, stubborn survival. Delche died in the winter of a lung sickness. The band scattered in the years that followed, some to the reservation, some south across the border, some into the mountains where they simply became the mountains, unreachable and permanent. Tucain went with a small group east, into country that wasn't on the army's maps because the army had never bothered to map it. He was never photographed. He gave no interviews. The bounty on his head stayed active for 11 years and was never collected. There is a man mentioned in the journals of a trader who worked the territory in those years, a man the trader describes as Apache-born, with perfect English and a quiet way of speaking, who came to his post twice a year to exchange pelts and occasionally purchase books. The trader notes that the man once asked for a copy of the territorial land records, which he studied for 2 hours before returning it without comment. The trader doesn't know his name. He describes him only as someone who seemed to carry more than one life. Soren Whitfield died in the boarding house in Benson the following spring. He was 68. The woman who ran the boarding house said that in his last weeks he asked frequently about a young man named Eli, whether he'd been heard from, whether anyone had news. She told him she didn't know. She was telling the truth. What she didn't know, what no one in Benson knew, was that on the morning of the day Soren died, a single wreath of dry desert flowers appeared on the wooden step outside his window. No one saw who placed it. No one came forward. It was there when the woman opened the door at first light, and it smelled of something wild and specific, something that didn't grow anywhere near Benson, that had traveled a long way to be there. The woman threw it away by noon because she didn't know what else to do with it. This is the part of history that gets lost, not the raids, not the bounties, not the newspaper headlines. The wreath, the 2-hour study of land records, the unsigned warning sent to a family of strangers. The man at the edge of a disappeared cottonwood tree, sitting still on his horse until a ranch hand came out with a rifle. To Kane, Eli Whitfield was not a simple story. He was what happens when you take a child and place him at the exact intersection of 2 worlds that are in the process of destroying each other, and then ask him to choose. He chose, and the choice was more complicated than either side ever wanted to admit, because the choice was not between his people and the people who raised him. It was between 2 versions of what it means to survive, and he found a way, imperfect, costly, and deeply human, to hold both. The West was full of stories like his. They just weren't the stories that got told. If this one stayed with you, leave a like and share it. And drop a comment below with the story you want us to tell next. There are more names that history buried, more lives that crossed the wrong lines at the wrong times and paid for it and kept going anyway. They deserve to be heard. We'll be here when you're ready for the next one.